attempting to disallow extreme speech drives it underground and in a way legitimates the struggle against mainstream society, whereas allowing it, as hateful as it is, at least helps you see and identify what's going on. Now, my understanding is that Breivik was actually much more moderate in his speech online than we now know his internal beliefs to be, which is to say, his radicalization does not seem to have been even if there were an effective way to remove, rather than merely driving underground, extreme speech, that would not seem to have been a solution to future Breivik's appearing. I think society needs to know what beliefs are on its fringe, and in the same way that we manage freedom of speech largely by letting people, essentially, we've managed freedom of speech largely by letting media outlets say what they're going to say, and then after the fact dealing with the consequences. I think that both for philosophical and practical reasons is how we'll have to approach this. An editor, but now the newspaper question is a different question, because in a way the state's attitude towards the sphere of public speech overall doesn't commit individual newspapers to these kinds of conversations. The problems, and in fact my production classes at NYU, the classes where we build and launch software, are all around the design of conversational spaces. They are all around trying to get conversation to happen. And as everybody has noticed, when you have an open conversational space, it can very quickly degenerate into kind of lowest common denominator conversation. That having been said, cutting off the conversation rather than trying to improve it strikes me as being a kind of extreme gesture, not even just as a citizen of a democracy, but also as a business case. One of the things the Guardian newspaper, for example, has found, they run a very large comment board called Comment is Free. And one of the things the Guardian has found is that, other things being equal, articles that have comments attached get more page views. More people come and read those articles than not. So it is, in a way, low-cost marketing for the ad-driven part of the paper. What I think the problem is around the attitude of newspapers and comments is that there are three things newspapers want. They want a lot of commenters, they want the comments to be good, and they want running the comment section to be low cost. And the problem is, pick two. Right? You can have any two of those three things, but not all. You can't have a large-scale, low-cost, high-quality comment section. And the Guardian's model has been, let's do enough filtering to keep the really hateful comments and the kinds of conversations that degenerate off the board, off these conversation sections. But if you're determined to have essentially low cost at all costs, then the logical answer is yes, shut your comment section down. So even setting aside, again, the democratic argument, I would say a newspaper that's shutting off its comment section may well be overlooking the way in which, for relatively small investment, it can get considerably more value than it would have gotten otherwise. In light of the Breivik, the shooting on the 22nd in Oslo, I can certainly see how an immediate reaction would be to say, this is so polarizing, and his ultranationalist, Knights Templar, anti-Muslim rhetoric is so hateful that we don't want to provide a spot for that to settle in. But one of the things we've learned, I think, from like the rise of Le Pen in France or the Vlaams Blok in Belgium and or the Flemish nationalists in Belgium and the Vlaams in Holland, is that when you actively target a particular ideology as being beyond the pale, you actually risk providing that same group with a rationale for continuing to fight the state or continuing to oppose the state rather than engaging. So I think over the long haul, both for reasons of business and democracy, the comment section of newspapers is in line with what the users want, and the newspaper can put itself in the position of raising the quality of the comments and avoiding the really, the degeneration into just pure hate speech without going all the way to turning it off.
So in general, you mean that we should face extreme statements online with openness?
Not exactly openness. I think that you should face extreme statements with a policy that says, if you're advancing a political point of view, we will listen. But if you were advocating hateful actions, or you're advocating demonizing one section of society, then we will edit you out. And what that does is it creates a dynamic in which participation in the comment section becomes contingent on behavior.
But you mean edit afterwards, right?
Yes, exactly.
Publish first.
Publish, then filter. Yes, exactly right. And very often, I think the publish then filter model does a better job of saying to the general public, you should know that these hateful views are out there, but you should also know that we're going to protect our comment section from becoming just a platform for them. But by splitting that difference, you actually end up engaging the hateful elements rather than simply driving them underground. I remember my parents very specifically saying, never tell anyone your address if they call us on the phone, and never tell anyone if mom and dad are home or not, right? And it was a thing you learned when you learned about the telephone as a child. We're having to do that now around Facebook and Flickr and so on. I think, though, the more general anxiety about oversharing almost always projected by old people onto young people misunderstands the enormity of what's happening. I'll give you an analogy from the United States. In 1992, we've had since the late 60s something that goes loosely by the name of the war on drugs, which is an attempt to broadly criminalize and keep down all forms of drug use from very hardcore heroin use down to smoking a joint. And it's been at the level of smoking a joint, it's been a pretty catastrophic failure. So in '92, a reporter asked Bill Clinton, when he was just a presidential candidate, have you ever smoked marijuana? And he said, yes, I did, but I didn't inhale, which was a ridiculous answer. In a way, it was such a ridiculous answer that it was a way of saying to the journalist, that's such a stupid question, I'm not even going to take it seriously. And really, from that moment, every sitting president of the United States has publicly admitted to doing drugs and has been elected anyway. So that was kind of the end of the war on drugs. So consider now Facebook. If I've got pictures of me up on Facebook at a party and I'm drunk or whatever, and a recruiter, if I'm applying for a job and a recruiter finds that picture, maybe I've got a problem. But if 10% of the candidates have those pictures up, the recruiter is the one who has the problem. Because we all know that there are things we did in our youth that if someone had taken a picture, we would not have the jobs we have now, right? I mean, we've always as a society carved out a space for people between roughly the ages of 15 and 25 to go a little crazy and for it to be okay to be a full member of society anyway.
So you're not so worried?
And in fact, I think the big social change is going to be that the recruiters and colleges of the world are going to learn, they're actually going to have to admit what we've all always known, which is that people's public and private behavior are not the same. And that if you can find evidence of private behavior that is surprising or shocking, it may be because you don't understand human nature rather than because that person is weird. And if we turn social media into a kind of surveillance state in which activities that we also engaged in but didn't get documented suddenly become punishable by not getting into law school or not getting a job, in the short term it seems like those individuals are suffering, but in the long term it's society that suffers. Because many of us who have, are perfectly stable adults and contributing members of society and raising a family, whatever, were crazy when we were 17 and 21. And we, if what we actually did had prevented us from going on to go to graduate school or get employed or whatever, it would be a disaster not just for us but for society. And so I think that we're going to come up with some negotiated bargain which says 21-year-olds are sharing pictures of themselves, drunk and in compromising positions and all the rest of it, and it is the job of the grown-ups to not look. It's funny, I started using the internet in the early 90s before the web was invented, and I'm particular, I used a medium called Usenet, which is this global collection of bulletin boards. And I would say that I was addicted to Usenet, and I would use the term in a completely unquoted clinical sense. Whenever anybody talks about digital addiction, I feel like I've felt it, and I completely buy that, not as a metaphor, but just as a description. And I remember waking up one morning in the middle of the 90s, a couple of years in, and I didn't need to check my email, which had been previously an almost physical compulsion to, log in. And it was like the fever had broken. And I have always remembered that day, because there are times when, particularly if you're having an argument with someone or some important group conversation is going on and it can seem really, really involving, you can get almost hollowed out by it. And in those cases, really what you have to do is you just have to disconnect, right? You have to unplug. And it is, there are some things you can do, there are some tools to sort of, make you right and limit your connection to the network and so forth. But really the most important input to that is just self-discipline, right? I'm putting the phone down, I'm walking away from the computer, I'm spending time with my children. We're going out, we're going to the zoo, we're going to a museum, whatever. I have gotten, I have to say, much better at both recognizing digital tiredness in myself and doing something about it. After the Industrial Revolution, and when work and life were decisively separated, we're now remixing them in the manner of cottage industries. But we're doing it without things like a weekend. So there may need to be another, one of the things I wrote about in Cognitive Surplus was this revolution around the 40-hour work week, right? Just and one of the specific workers' chants around the 40-hour work week was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. So there was a specific idea of carving out time for the workers to do something other than work or sleep. We may have to do that again, but this time not so much around industrial work as it was at the time, but literally around our BlackBerries. That it may have to be okay that my BlackBerry was off on Saturday.
8 hours? Are you kidding me?
Right. But that's the part that has to be a social solution, because in a way it has to be, businesses have to understand that the function of the weekend is not to lower the amount of work, but actually to cut it off for a while. In a way, it depends on what part of the knowing of them do you mean. If you mean the news is going to be printed 20 miles away from me yesterday, and then through some elaborate network of trucks and kids on bicycles it's going to get to my front yard, no, probably not. That was always a crazy system. It's just we didn't have anything better. Now I've got a printer 20 inches from me. I can print the news right now and read it off the printer. So I still get the printed word. I just get it from Hewlett Packard instead of the New York Times. On the other hand, as an institution in society that makes makes it its business to produce the civically valuable news, I can at the very least say, I hope so. I hope that survives, because I don't see, for a lot of things that the web has destroyed, it's replaced with a better version of it. I think that the music universe right now is so infinitely superior to what I grew up with top 40 radio and a handful of record stores. Now, the incredible cornucopia and diversity of music, past and present, that I have access to at any given moment, mind-boggling. I don't think that's happening to news. In part because news is boring, in part because news requires people to go after, powerful interests who are hiding things. We need some set of institutions who have very large-scale, very long-term time commitments to this news. And if by that you mean newspapers as we know them, as a democracy, we need those to survive. In part because
it doesn't have to be like paper.
Doesn't have to be paper, and in many cases it's already not paper. I mean, to a first approximation, the New York Times readership isn't on paper. Now, the people who buy the paper are disproportionately engaged and valuable to that paper's current economic fortunes, but in terms of head count, it's maybe 5% of the total. So in a way, the transition has already happened, but I think it's much more the institutional role in society than either the production model or the business model that's really what's at stake. More freedom of speech, more freedom of inquiry, more freedom of expression has historically led to better, more representative democracies. And it is a bumpy road, God knows, as it was when the printing press came along. It's not like the printing press came along and then people had the scientific revolution the next day, right? We had the 30 Years' War in there, where the religious upset that the Protestants were, using the printing press to help fuel, came before what we know of now as a relatively stable European context. So I'm perfectly willing to believe that the internet is going to disrupt more things than it fixes in the short term. But in the long term, when you increase the number of people in a society who can speak out loud and have other people hear their thoughts, those societies become better over the long term. So that's why I'm optimistic about these effects as a kind of, in the grand sweep of history.